All right, Haven, I love it, man. You're animated today. It's a hard act to follow. Very cool. Thank you. Well, I am super excited. Hopefully, this conversation will change the way you think about design thinking, innovation. Hopefully, it'll change the way you think about the future of business. Just delighted to have Tim here. Unbelievable what you've been able to accomplish in your career as one of the former CEO and now chairman of IDEO, as well as the vice chair of Q Collective. Just going to be exciting today to hear your thoughts. You have spoken. I'm just going to go a little bit of a bio. Haven, you reported some of what Tim is involved with. If you're not aware of his incredible career, just a couple of things. He is obviously seen as one of the architects of design. I mean, and what that means to me is when you've seen these products, some of the ones in your life that you feel like, holy blank, how did they come up with that? Or businesses where you go, wow, how did they all of a sudden start competing so dominantly against their competitors? Those things that you felt and that just have been magic in the minds of how they thought about it have probably come from Tim and from IDEO. He has spoken at Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Rotman Magazine. Of course, he's a best-selling author of Change by Design. I encourage you all to check that out. But you really focus, and I think in addition to design, you know, in knowing you, in leadership, and also in human-centered design, your leadership and strategic application of design covers everything from health, education, technology, mobility, and global development. So on behalf of everyone here at mHUB and the HardTech Summit, you know, we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. You raised the bar pretty high. I don't know whether we'll get over it or not, but many thanks for the very kind introduction.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And I'm going to jump right into kind of design a little bit. We've grouped this into a couple things, design and product around business. And you know, since you've been involved with design thinking, you've been one of the early pioneers. You've brought it to the world. You've done it for decades. You know, in my mind, it's now a little bit, design thinking is almost becoming, you know, a corporate buzzword. So let's get real for a minute. You know, many companies don't actually know what to do with design and design thinking. What's the biggest myth or misconception you see about design thinking in organizations today?
Well, I suppose if you want to call it a myth, misconception may be a better term, is that design tends to be thought of something you do at the end. It tends to be sort of something that you kind of wrap around whatever your idea is in order to make it maybe a bit more appealing, maybe convince a few venture investors that might be something worth investing in, whatever. But, I mean, the evidence is, and there's a lot of evidence out there, I mean, there have been various organizations around the world that have been tracking the kind of business impact of design for a long time. And the organizations, the companies that build design into the fabric of what they do, so into their products and services, but also into the way they think about leadership and management, on average, outperform their competitors by double. Wow. In other words, for large companies, that means their returns in the S&P or the FTSE 100 or wherever you're doing them is twice what their competitors would be. Same with startups. So that's pretty good evidence, I think, that when you treat design not as something you think about at the end, but something that's inherent in your business and inherent in the products and services you build, just like you would say the same for engineering or technology or marketing or sales, then you do pretty well.
Very cool. And again, some of these businesses that you've helped transform are just remarkable. And when I look back and seeing what you've done in your career, I go, well, how did you start? You started as an industrial designer. And how did you go from making things to shaping the way businesses think?
Well, I fell into art school in England a long time ago and found design. I didn't really know much about it when I started. I knew I was interested in making things. I knew I was interested in not going into a sort of a conventional silo, and that's one of the things I found exciting about design, particularly what we call product design or industrial design, is that it's at the kind of intersection of so many interesting things. Yes, it's about how people use things. It's about how people, what makes a product desirable, but it's also about how it's engineered and how it's marketed. I was interested in engineering and physics. I was interested in history. I was interested in culture, and so design seemed a great place to bring all those things together. So I was pretty excited about it when I discovered it, and went through many years of design school in the UK. And this is, I'll go on a little side note here because I think it's relevant, which is the UK happens to be a country that's heavily invested in creative education. In the 1980s, when I was at design school, we had a government that was basically paying me to go through 7 years of design school. And there's a lot of people like me who would never have got through design school. I couldn't, my parents couldn't have afforded me. I couldn't have afforded to go through an American school, I'm pretty sure. Ended up as designers who've been relatively successful around the world. And there's a fairly long history of British designers have ended up coming over here and doing okay. My friend Johnny Ive being another one. But
the British invasion.
And so, yeah,
design
just
style.
like in music, right? But that investment in creative education, in design education, I think is key. And we're seeing it happen in other countries. It's never been quite, had quite the level of investment here in the US that it's had in other places. We're seeing it in China today. Literally hundreds of thousands of designers are coming out of design schools in China right now. And that's as big a threat, I think, to American competitiveness as technology that's getting developed over there, or the manufacturing expertise that's getting developed over there. We haven't never really invested. We've got some great design education programs here in the US. Northwestern's got some great program, obviously Stanford, and then some great design schools around the country, but we don't have enough. Anyway, sorry, that was a side note. But anyway, I found myself in design very early on. I got interested in a question, and I've been basically asking that question for 40 years since, which has always been, what's next for design? How can design have a bigger impact in the world? How can design be more relevant to business? How can design be more relevant to society? How can it help solve bigger and more complex problems? So that's what's led me on the journey that I've been. That's what's caused me to kind of explore and investigate ways of thinking about design, talking about design, that make it more accessible to other people. It's what's led me towards trying to create tools that other people can use and in their own work and in their own businesses.
So cool. It's so cool you're sort of a magic that I feel at IDEO in visiting all the offices. And somehow, again, you've created that process that really allows for that magic to happen, and I just applaud you for it. And I want to hear, give us a real world example then. Give us an industry where design thinking solved the problem no one expected us to. What in your, let's say even your recent 15 years, what's a huge surprise or that woke up one of the companies or woke up the industry at large? I mean,
one, it's maybe a good one to talk about because I think it's relevant to maybe some of the audience here, which is it was an early stage startup that got incubated at IDEO in our office in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. Could just as easily have happened here in Chicago, I think. And it was, the guy who started it had this idea that the pharmacy experience was terrible for most people, right? And it is terrible, right? Especially as you accumulate diseases, you get more and more pills, and trying to kind of manage that process of getting the right pills at the right time, and it was a terrible experience. So he landed at IDEO, and we put a team around him and developed this business called PillPack. And PillPack was kind of end-to-end kind of pharmacy delivery. All of your pills are put into daily envelopes, little tear-off envelopes, personalized to you. There's a whole kind of hardware piece to it. There's a huge software piece to it. There's a big experience design piece to it. Totally integrated top to bottom. I think they raised about $60 million worth of venture capital to launch that business. They sold a couple of years later to Amazon for $1 billion.
Wow.
And the difference, the idea was important, but it was the execution that was important, and most of that was design. There wasn't really any new technology. The software applications were were well thought through, and there was a lot of detail, operational detail, in getting in delivering absolutely accurately and perfectly safely pills and other pharmaceuticals, obviously. But really, the difference in that business was design. And the return's pretty decent in a very short period of time. So that's an example, relatively small one, but I think it's
it's a great one, and I wish it applied to more things. I spent 45 minutes today trying to get my son a prescription fulfilled through Walgreens.
Yeah.
So have them call.
Well, you can get PillPack off of Amazon now, so they make it really easy.
That's really cool. I'm going to move a little bit to kind of the leadership role of design thinking. And one of the things that I've seen is, innovation is a buzzword in a lot of companies, but how do you convince what I'd call the spreadsheet crowd, the CFOs, the kind of hardcore, buttoned up business types, that design thinking isn't just a nice to have or something that one person can do, it's a fundamental business strategy, which is what you've taught me. How do you get these guys to see that? And
I mean, it depends. If you're talking about large companies, it's a different problem because CFOs have got a lot on their plate. I mean, at a large company versus maybe a small startup where hopefully many founding teams of small startups don't even have CFOs, right? And these days they're often fractional CFOs. But with large companies, actually, to be honest, it's no different than it is for most disciplines, which is design and the value of design and the value of really understanding your customer and creating products and services that meet the needs that you can see or that you can reveal or discover versus what some market research report may tell you. It's very hard to convince people of the value of that unless they kind of see it in action. So I'll give you an example. For many years ago, I spent a long time working with A.G. Lafley, who was the then CEO of Procter & Gamble. And he was convinced that P&G could get a long way by getting much closer to its consumers and getting much closer to design and using design as well as R&D. Obviously, they have massive R&D capability. And he wanted, amongst other things, his leadership to get behind it because he was going to take a lot of risk. I mean, maybe do a lot of things that didn't seem obvious or that were newer and more innovative. And so one of the things that we did over a couple of years is he brought his whole leadership team, including a very skeptical CFO, to Palo Alto, and we put them basically through kind of design boot camp. These were the C-suite of I don't know what it was then, but it was a tens of billions of dollars, $100 billion company probably. And we were sending them off out into the street doing user observations and building prototypes. And these people had never picked up an X-Acto knife in their life, probably. And this guy, Clay, I can't remember his surname now. Anyway, he was the CFO at the time, super skeptical guy. He became one of the biggest advocates for design in P&G because he had an intuition about it. I mean, I'm not saying we proved that design was worth it in those boot camps, but at least he understood what was going on, and also it took the real leadership from AG, who was also there going out and doing the same things as his team was. So I think that we all have to experience the benefits of design because it's not a mathematical subject, right? You can't write an equation and prove that the outcome is going to work before you do it. You discover the value of design by doing it, and so people have to experience it.
Very, very cool. And so thinking about that now for the entrepreneur, the small companies, it's never too early, right? You're one of the ones I think I've heard you say, the absolute best time to start is on day one.
Well, I mean, my view is that almost all entrepreneurs are designers anyway. Because how can you possibly build a company that's attempting to serve a need, often a new need that people haven't served before, and not be thinking about how do you convert those needs into something, right? I mean, it's what you're doing as an entrepreneur, right? So you may not have, as an entrepreneur, formal design training, and you may not be as comfortable with some of the aspects of fulfilling those needs that are to do with more of the kind of intuitive, emotional, kind of desirability part of the puzzle. But you're still designing. You're still trying to... My favorite definition of design, and it's one that came from Herbert Simon, who is the grandfather of AI, Nobel Prize winner, and his definition was, whenever we take an existing situation and seek to improve it, then we're designing.
Very
it's
cool.
a very, very simple definition. And what are we doing as entrepreneurs? We're taking the absence of something maybe, or something that's not working very well, and we're improving it, and we're building a business around that. So my view is that all entrepreneurs are designing. I think there are additional aspects of design maybe that they can, and you know, we've seen some very successful companies over the last couple of decades who've had designers on the founding team who've been able to maybe stretch what's possible, particularly when it comes to the behavior of customers, that might not have occurred to people from an engineering background or from a business school background. I mean, a good example of that's Airbnb. Two of the founders came from a design background, the other was from an engineering background, and their whole problem was all about designing for trust, right? I mean, who in their right mind is going to let strangers come and rent a bedroom they'd never met before? Or who in their right mind would go and stay at a home with people they'd never met before? I mean, it was a crazy concept, you know, in the abstract, unless you understand that the problem is how do you create an experience where you're designing for trust all the way along, and everything you're doing is about reinforcing that idea of trust. They understood that as designers, and that's what they did with Airbnb, and led to, you know, at least according to them, when they've kind of talked about it, led to this kind of the success and growth of the business. So you know, some of those kinds of challenges may be a bit difficult to take on if you don't have an understanding of how to design for human behavior, for instance.
Very cool. Yeah, and that's one of the best, I'm sure everybody's seen it, but Airbnb, when you look at like examples of startup pitches, the 20-slide deck, it's absolutely genius. Everybody should take a look at it. But so thinking about that and thinking about innovation, if it's not embedded, if you're not founded by two designers, if you are like an mHUB type engineering hard tech startup, is there a way to teach innovation, or is there a way for the fundamentals to start and to bake it into your company?
Well, again, we have to be a little bit careful about definitions, I think, because there's plenty of innovation that's nothing to do with design, right? There's plenty of innovation that's purely technological innovation, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room, that's what they're doing, right? They're creating technologies that haven't existed before, and there's a lot of innovation in that process. When we're talking about innovation from a design perspective, we're talking about making some leap from an unfulfilled need and figuring out how to solve for that need that may or may not require new technology to do it. I mean, there's lots of innovation in the world, lots of design-led innovation that doesn't require new technology. It might require the clever use of existing technology, but it doesn't necessarily require new technology. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that point. Because otherwise I think there's a bunch of people in this audience saying, I'm doing lots of innovation, thank you very much, even without being a designer. So I just wanted to, I kind of want to clarify that. And there are some kind of economies where that has been the primary focus. I do a lot of work in Japan, and if you look at the way, I mean, we have a perspective on the Japanese economy from over here, which is that it's largely been in hibernation for the last 30 years. And the bit that we used to think of the Japanese economy, which were the Toyotas and Sonys and Mitsubishis and of the world, kind of have been not in a hibernation, but that's not been growing particularly. But what's been happening over the last 30 years, well, nobody's been noticing, is that Japan has figured out how to dominate about 900 niche technology markets. All through technological innovation. So things like the most high-end resists for chip manufacturing all come from Japan, right? The carbon fiber market, they dominate over 50% of the carbon fiber market. And so they've used a kind of highly technology-focused approach to entrepreneurship, I suppose, to kind of rebuild that economy. And that's really the Japanese economy today is much more of a business-to-business economy than it is a business-to-consumer economy. So I find that quite interesting. But you know, to go back to your original question, you know, you should. I think any entrepreneur, any innovator should be thinking really hard about who the customer is, and what can I learn from who I think the customer is going to be or is, or the user. And if you're in a B2B environment, that often means I don't only need to understand my customer, but I need to understand my customer's customer. Because whatever they're taking my technology and turning it into something else. So how can I help them understand their customer better? What, by learning about them, can I use to solve my problem differently? And sometimes that might just be little things. Sometimes it might be features or details, or it might be the way you talk about your product. I mean, an interesting example, one of the startups that I remember IDEO working with a long time ago now was a Kleiner, I think it was a Kleiner-backed venture, and IDEO invested in it also. Craig Sampson back there, you might remember, I can't remember the company now, but they were doing wireless pagers, or it was a wireless kind of communication technology. Do you remember it? Sorry? Was it Lifeline? But the biggest thing that design, I think we did as designers for them, was figure out how to tell a story about what it was they were doing. And we made a movie to tell the story about what they were doing. And that's what got them their first round of venture capital. So their design didn't play a role, because the thing itself was like a little box that hung around somebody's neck. I mean, it didn't do a lot. But the story of how this system worked was something they had not figured out how to tell. And it made all the difference when it came to raising venture funds. So design might make a difference around the storytelling as much as the product experience itself.
Very cool. I was going to ask you about storytelling, and I actually deleted it from my questions because it's one of the challenges we see here, so I want to bring it back. And then I want to talk to you about the future, too, and I want to talk to you about AI. But just thinking a moment on storytelling again, in the creativity, you use the word in your speeches and in your books a lot about engineers and about design and how the creative process is fundamental, but also that storytelling process is fundamental in design. Explain that a little bit. Is that working with the groups that you talk about and interconnectivity, but you mentioned quite a bit that creativity and storytelling is something equally as important as the business model.
Well, anytime you conceive of something new, you have to bring that thing to life in the minds of the people that you're trying to sell the idea to.
Like pre-visualization, kind of.
Well, it might be. I mean, it might be your investors. It might be your first customers. It might even be your colleagues. But you have to bring that thing to life. And I used to believe, when early on in my career as a designer, as a physical product designer, industrial designer, that all I had to do was make the product, and then I could put it under a black sheet, and then I could wait for the client to walk in the room. I could whip the sheet off, and they would totally understand why I designed something that was truly brilliant. Okay? Of course, that's rubbish. They had no idea what to think about or what. I mean, they may like what it looked like or not. More likely, if you take that approach, they start complaining that they don't like that particular color blue, which is not a great way to start a conversation. You have to tell us anything new requires a story in order to sit it in the mind of those that you're trying to have come along on the journey with you. Obviously that's what marketing's all about. It's your business, but that has to happen really early on. So there's a very famous designer, a guy by the name of Tinker Hatfield, first designer at Nike. When he first started working there, it was in the very early days, he decided the best way, because everybody else at Nike really was either runners or they were marketing people, right? They didn't understand design, they didn't understand product development. So he decided the best way to kind of explain his new ideas for shoes wasn't to show them a prototype or tell them, it was to make an ad. So every new concept that he created, he made a little short home video style ad for that concept. And that's what he showed his colleagues to get an idea off the ground, because he understood how important storytelling was to get something started and
honoring the athlete,
and
not
that's
the shoe.
I mean, it's one of the reasons why video is so powerful in the development process. I mean, it's like we've always had this mantra at IDEO, which is basically how fast can you make your first prototype. I think these days, alongside that, it's like how fast can you make your first video, right? That tells the story. Because if you're going to make a video, you have to have a narrative, right? You actually have to have a storyline. You can't make a video without having a storyline. Even if it's simply a couple of you acting out the thing that you're trying to make, you have a storyline. And that rigor, that discipline, helps you think whether you've got a good idea or not.
I absolutely love that, and I think you're speaking to me and speaking to my heart. But I would say, even for big corporations, they should be doing more of that in today's day and age. But certainly for the startup entrepreneurs, that's really, really good advice. That's and in easy and inexpensive way, maybe to help showcase.
All you need is your phone. You don't need anything else.
Yeah, amazing. So now let's skip a little bit to the future. Talk about AI. We had dinner last night, and I couldn't sleep last night because you scared the heck out of me. In some ways good, in some ways bad. But
what did I say that scared you?
Well, first off, AI, is it friend or foe for the designers? You've called it both an opportunity and a threat. What's the reality? When does it come in, and what do we do?
I think if anybody thinks they know the reality of the impact of AI, they're kind of kidding themselves, right? We simply don't know yet. I have some beliefs. So we're already seeing tools beginning to emerge, whether they're on existing platforms like Adobe's tools or whatever, or new ones that are making it possible to iterate and kind of execute on design much, much faster than it was possible before, which is a good thing. And I mean, it's a good thing in the sense that the more iterations we can do, the design always gets better when you do more iterations. So if we can move faster, we can get iteration faster, we can get feedback faster, we can take our ideas further in any given time frame. So that's good. The other thing that's interesting is, I think, I'm not sure it's quite true yet, but I think what's going to be true is these tools will be a lot easier to use. One of my criticisms of computer-aided design tools, I mean, they were just emerging as I was starting my career 35 years ago, and they've always required a fairly high overhead, user experience overhead, right? Whether you're talking about 2D tools like Illustrator or Photoshop, or 3D tools, they require a fairly high investment of time and energy and actually knowledge in terms of how to use them in order to get anything particularly productive out of them. Which means, in my view, too much effort is there's essentially invested in the execution of the idea or the visualization of the idea rather than the idea itself. So two things happen by making that a lot easier, because the interface perhaps is something where you can speak to it, or you can write a prompt as well as do other things. Prompts alone are no way to design, in my opinion, but they're a useful addition. We do two things. Firstly, we make it possible for people who, for whatever reason, did not go up that learning curve on the existing tools to be able to execute on their ideas, which I think is great. And for those who already do know how to use the tools, they can move much faster. So I think we'll see some interesting implications in terms of shortening design times, of being able to explore more options, which I think is really exciting. The challenge that AI, I think, or at least the obvious ones that I see, one is that right now, in just like in engineering or law or a lot of other fields, a lot of how people become expert in their field is by doing a lot of these sort of entry-level kind of, maybe you are executing on somebody else's design by building their CAD database for them, or you're spending a lot of time doing relatively low-level things, but by doing it, you're building up a lot of expertise and you're working with experts. And I just wonder how that's going to happen in the future, because if that's all being automated or that's all been done by technology, where are young designers, young engineers, young lawyers, young accountants, where are they going to get that where are they going to get those iterations from? Where are they going to get that experience from that allows them to become the experts of the future? I just chaired a panel and a roundtable at something called the World Government Summit a couple of weeks ago, and I had, amazing group of people, like the head of product for LinkedIn. I had a bunch of university professors, and nobody had an answer to that question. And in terms of the future pipeline, it was interesting. I was talking to one of the senior AI guys at Microsoft just the other day, and he said something interesting. We said, if I give the latest AI programming tools to relatively inexperienced engineers, you get something adequate out of it. You get an okay result. But when I give it to my best engineers, that's when we see things that are spectacular. We see spectacular results. So that would argue that we have a need for expertise, and it would also suggest the other thing, which I think is going to be true, which is as AI in all of these fields grows, then it puts more and more onus on the quality of the idea, which again is something that comes from experience and expertise, or at least having gone through iterations enough times. So I'm a little worried about that. I'm a little worried about, it'll be great for the people who are already experts, but it's going to be tough for people who are trying to get up that curve. Does that mean we're going to be needing engineers and designers to be in education for 15 years before they can start working professionally? And if we do, how are we going to pay for that? I mean, there's some pretty big, I wonder about some things like that, right?
Yeah, that's precisely why I didn't sleep last night, because I'm not an expert in anything. You scared the hell out of me. So moving on a little bit to manufacturing, though, and I think one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really cool is the world's sort of obsessed with faster, cheaper global manufacturing. But it's colliding with this push for localized, sustainable, I think you called it ultra bespoke production. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you mean by that?
Well, I'm kind of fascinated by, our current industrial model for the economy, never mind just manufacturing, is sort of based on a kind of one-size-fits-all notion, right? Which is that at least manufacturing is done at scale for everything, right? And that the most efficient way of delivering products and experiences to customers is by figuring out how to make the most of something, which is always going to drive you to places and types of manufacturing which are large-scale, inexpensive, kind of efficiency-based. But I don't see that as being the only model that works. And I mean, the best example I think I have of that for me is in the software world, which is open source software doesn't operate that way, right? I mean, open source software has been evolving and been built on over the last 20 years or whatever, however long it's been. And yes, we have platforms, right? We have large-scale platforms, on top of which we can now build very bespoke things, relatively inexpensively. So you can think of that as an equivalent to being local. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I'm no expert in manufacturing, but I think that as we get our hands on approaches to manufacture that might take some large-scale things, like, it's not like, the best and fastest processors are ever going to be made in tiny numbers and locally. They're still going to require huge investments and therefore likely to be made in a few places in the world. But there's a lot of other things that we need to manufacture in order to deliver a product experience to people that may not need to be thought of that way. And as we get technologies, whether they're printing technologies or other technologies that allow us to make differently, then it seems to me that we might end up in a world where we have a relatively fewer number of very large-scale manufacturers, platform manufacturers, and maybe a host of smaller product, kind of the people who make the thing that finally ends up in the hands of the customer. I don't know, that could be an interesting world. I don't know what form it would take, and I don't know what it, I mean, it's unlikely to apply to motor cars very soon, or some other kinds of products, but there are a lot of products it could apply to. And so that would indicate to me that would then start to bring manufacturing perhaps much closer to home. And then all of the things that you intimated in around sustainability and circularity is something that, so circular economy is something I've been working on for a while, and that is really hard to do over distance. It's so expensive to make a bunch of stuff in one place, ship it all over the world, and then try and gather it all back together again and get it back to the place you made it, and then remake again. It's very, very hard to do that. But if you've got local manufacture, it's much, much easier. And so I think as we perhaps strive for making more effective and efficient use of our resources, and people figure out how to do this circular economy thing, then I think that might show up as much more of a local thing.
Very cool, and cool for Chicago. I hope that comes. Hope that comes true. You've talked a little bit about, you've been around the world, you've worked in and traveled the world, and as you say, you're working a lot in Japan and seeing stuff that's going on there and comparing it to the U.S. Is now a good time to start a company in the United States?
I mean, the U.S. has always been a good time to start a company, hasn't it? I mean, I came from this little country over the Atlantic called the UK. That used to be kind of a big country in a certain way, and not anymore. And I just couldn't believe the difference in scale when it came to and this is 35 years ago, in the ambition of entrepreneurs in the US compared to the UK or even the rest of Europe. I mean, the UK gets excited when one interesting company appears every 10 years, right? I mean, here we don't get excited unless there's at least a dozen, entries into the Fortune 100 every decade. I mean, the level of ambition in this country is still second to none, and because of that, access to capital, access to all the knowledge that goes around being on. I mean, just the existence of this great place, I mean, is at the scale of it. I mean, I can't remember how many startups Haven mentioned have come out of mHUB so far. It's hundreds, right?
Oh yeah.
How many? 750, right? Yeah. 750. I bet there haven't been 750 come out of all of the universities of the UK put together in the last 10 years, right? And I may be being a bit cruel when I say that, but I'm not a million miles out when I say that. I mean, and you're one of these. I mean, and these things are dotted around the country.
We are the best here,
You are the best. Yeah. I get that, and you're the best because you focused a little bit. And what happens in the Bay Area is very different to what happens here. But that level of ambition and that level of scale that's possible because you've got a city like Chicago and an economy like that you've got here, or like the Bay Area, or Cambridge, or Austin, or wherever you're talking about. I mean, it's remarkable. And so, yeah, of course, it's a good time to start a company in the US, and of course, there really is no, and there's a reason why all my friends that start companies in Germany and the UK all come here.
Wow.
They all end up coming here to raise money. They all end up moving their businesses here, or the vast majority of them do, because this is still the best place to do startup.
Fantastic. Now, but you do say, and one of the things that you've certainly taught me, and we've by the parent company that bought my last company and bought IDEO, which is Japanese, they think very long term, and in 100-year plan kind of thing. Talk about the benefits of that and your experience working in Japan, of how they keep longevity and innovation going for so long, and what can we learn here in the short-term thinking of the U.S. mindset? What can we do differently?
I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because clearly the sort of absolute focus on entrepreneurialism, building companies that create some value is works, right? But it does mean that we sometimes miss the big picture, right? And I think thinking longer term, I don't know that that's the job of entrepreneurs. Well, I think some entrepreneurs, absolutely it's their job, because you're committing to technologies or products or services that are about solving long-term problems, like climate, for instance.
Yep.
So there are plenty of entrepreneurs who are thinking long-term, but other people need to be thinking about long-term also, not just entrepreneurs, in order to create the conditions where it's possible to think long-term. But it is necessary for a bunch of reasons. And one of the things I find about Japan is that business leaders there, and government also, tends to take a slightly more balanced view between the economic benefits that come from business and the societal benefits that come from business. Now, that can sometimes mean they make choices that slow things down a bit, but it also means they make choices that are often in a slightly better interest of the collective and everybody. And that's because they're a highly collective-oriented society. We're a very individualistically oriented society. So you kind of get a different outcome. But one of the things that concerns me, particularly about, I've been kind of an advocate for, some of you may know Kevin Kelly, who's the founder of Wired magazine, wrote a book about a decade ago called What Technology Wants. And he did a pretty good job of explaining how technology will evolve along its own path, kind of no matter what we do, and well, unless we think about it, right? And I really do think that technology will get what it wants if we don't decide what we want. And it's not about whether the technology is valuable or not, but it's how we deploy it. It's where we use it. It's where we regulate it. It's what we want the ultimate outcome to be. We have to be thinking about these things, I believe, if we want societies that are fair, that that offer opportunity to everybody, that don't destroy the planet we rely on to live on. And those kinds of questions require slightly longer term thinking. So somehow, and I don't know how quite, I have no magic answer for how we do that, but we have to find ways of thinking about the immediate problem at hand and think about things in a slightly longer term way.
Very cool advice. I have one more question before we go to Q&A, and it's a personal one. Or I want you to kind of go and tell a personal story here. So you've influenced, industries, written bestsellers, changed how companies think about design and innovation. But what's the defining moment in your career that shaped your leadership style and philosophy on design thinking?
I suppose the defining moment was when I got to what eventually became IDEO. So I came out of design school, came out of the top design school in the world, thinking I knew everything about design, because all I'd done for the last 7 or 8 years is spend my time with other people who were just like me. And had come through the same experience as me, had much of the same background as me. And I got hired by this guy called Bill Mogridge, who was one of the founders of IDEO, along with David Kelly, who was the professor of design at Stanford. And the thing that Bill had done was he'd always believed that design was a bigger thing than just people who'd gone through design school, like he had done and like I had done. So so when I joined his company, ended up in San Francisco, where we had computer scientists and engineers and psychologists and communications people. We had this incredibly rich, interdisciplinary group of people who were all designing. And so I went from this kind of very kind of homogeneous view of what design was and the world of design to a heterogeneous one, where I saw in front of my eyes better ideas emerging at the intersections between these disciplines than in the core of any one of them, right? And that was mind-blowing for me and totally changed the way that I thought about design. And everything else was a result of that. So Bill and David Kelly, and they basically, through creating IDEO, created the most interdisciplinary design organization that had been up to that point. Maybe there still has ever been. And that was the secret, the core of the secret to the success of IDEO. Because what that did was attract really good people who wanted to work with other people who were different to them. And we all know that when you have that virtuous cycle of you're doing something that attracts really good people, you do even better things that attract even better people. And that virtuous circle was crucial to the success of IDEO, I think.
So cool. Well, we have a little bit of time to open it up to the audience for questions. We have one over here. Okay, you've got one already?
Yeah. There's been a recent shift in the design community from design thinking to systems thinking, including the Institute of Design right here in Chicago. And I'd love to get your thoughts. Is systems thinking something new? Is it an aha moment, or just something that is a variation on a theme?
I guess I don't want to I don't want to underplay how difficult applying design to systems is. It's very difficult, but it's a natural extension of design thinking in my view. In fact, one of the reasons I got excited about design thinking, because I was interested in the design of systems. And I felt like if we didn't understand how design actually worked, we couldn't get beyond the things where we can do it intuitively. And relatively simple things we can design relatively intuitively. Complex things you cannot design that way, right? You've got to study them from different perspectives. You've got to bring different expertise together. You've got to have a way of creating a shared dialogue. And a lot of that is what, in my view, design thinking is about. So designing systems is a very difficult thing to do, but I see it as an extension of design thinking. I actually don't think we have cracked it yet by a long way. I think what tends to happen as we start talking about the design of systems is we get quite, we can very easily get quite academic about it. And then they lose the thing that's often most magical and important to them. They lose that kind of, that sort of the innovation. They can lose the kind of emotional bit, whatever. And actually, that's one of the places I think AI could be quite useful, because AI can be a tool for handling more complexity. So we can build, for instance, simulations and models of systems as prototypes in a way that we can't do in the real world, right? So, and we're already beginning to see that. And so using digital twins of complex systems as a way of prototyping those systems and exploring them and designing with them, seeing what happens when you push them here or change them there, I think is going to be very valuable in systems design.
Hello. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say it's truly an honor that you're here, and thank you for talking to us. Really quick to introduce myself, my name is PJ. I am an aspiring experience designer, currently running my own experiential marketing agency to help nonprofits fundraise with charity concerts. My question for you is, like many other people, I read the Fast Company article about IDEO doing its round of layoffs, and they made a really disturbing claim, which is that the era of design thinking is coming to an end. I just want to ask you your thoughts on that. Going back to that question, what's next for design thinking? Is it restructuring design consultancies? Is it freelancers? What does that look like in the future, my generation, as I'm coming into a career in this field?
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish. I mean, Fast Company likes big headlines, right? So, I mean, like any media outlet, so, you know. But I think it is important to distinguish between what design is and how design gets done, right? So I don't think what design is fundamentally changing. How design gets done may be changing. And maybe the models that we have of the past, which are essentially a choice between either kind of corporate design teams inside large companies or agencies working maybe for startups or maybe for large companies as really being the only two choices, or individual freelance designers trying to make a living. I think there may be other models for how design gets done in the future. One of those is the kind of venture model where you're getting venture studios beginning to appear, which have designers in-house to help entrepreneurs. So that's a different model, right? Where the kind of venture capital, part of what it covers is that investment in design. And Google started that with Google Ventures more than a decade ago, but Andreessen and Horowitz have got designers in there. I mean, there are different versions of that popping up. So that might be one model. There's no doubt that it's much easier for designers with expertise to play fractional roles or kind of be independent but still find interesting work than it used to be. I mean, it used to be the advantage that somebody like IDEO had was that access to the interesting work, right? But I think while IDEO still, and companies like IDEO still has that, I think it's possible to find access to that work and not be part of one of those kinds of companies. So really, I think we're talking about maybe that there are differences in the way design gets done. But I don't think design, what actually design is necessarily changing very much. I think there are still far too few designers in the world, in my view. There is something like a 10-to-1 ratio between business school grads and design grads. That can't be right. That can't be right. Sorry to all of the business school grads who might be in the room. And so there are so many design problems. But I think we might need some innovation in sort of how design gets done and how design gets invested in. And it's been a tough few years, I would have to say. The last 3-4 years have been very difficult for some of the existing kind of models. Actually, not just in design either. I mean, in advertising, it's been very difficult. In management consulting, it's been quite challenging. I mean, so it's been a tricky time. But I would have confidence that your skills as a designer are going to be incredibly useful in the future. For sure.
Do we have one more question, do you think?
I think we've got at least a couple.
Hi, thank you. Very captivating chat. I just wanted to ask you, kind of going back to what you were saying about storytelling and AI. There is this friction and objection to AI use among the designers because of the IPs and other problems with the AI and how it works. As a neuroscientist, I think there are a lot of similarities as to how we create and how AI create. and it will even more converging in the future. The question I have for you is, what would be the storytelling or story that you would create to not just sell, but inspire other designers to use AI to become even more creative? Or can you see a way to merge the designers with AI use?
Yeah, I mean, understandably, those and it's not just designers, right? Any creative people that have invested in developing a lot of content, in whatever form you want, that content is used to train models that then can replicate what those creative people do. So whether it's in music, whether it's in illustration, whether it's in graphic design, it's happening a little less in product design, but I mean, maybe it will happen. You can understand why people would be a little upset about that. However, there are already tools beginning to appear which don't do any of that, right? Which don't learn from other people's work, but they learn from sort of fundamental principles. And there are design tools beginning to appear that have not been trained on existing work. So I think that's a good thing. It's also, by the way, much more efficient to do that. And some of these models are able to run much more efficiently with much less computation than the kind of massive LLMs that we've seen in the last 18 months. So this is me talking not as a deep AI expert, by the way, but this is what I've seen and some of these companies that I've been looking at. So I think that's interesting, and I think we'll see other development. I mean, when I talk to designers about my thinking about AI, it's a bit like these are tools for making our brains bigger and our arms longer. Right? We can reach further, we can do more, we can think about more things. That can't be a bad thing, at least in the abstract. The other thing that gives me confidence about the need for the kind of human factor when it comes to creativity and design, not just AI, is this weird phenomena that exists in our species, and it's called taste. We don't talk about it very much, but things that we like today are not things that we're going to like tomorrow or the day after, because our tastes change. Now, we obviously see that in fashion design and some of the fast-moving kind of cultural artifacts we have, but it happens in absolutely everything. It even happens in science, right? Tastes change. And so technologies that rely on learning everything from the past have a really hard time anticipating or even creating new tastes. It's hard for them to be avant-garde. So cool. And I believe that in many aspects of our society and many of the products and services that we will continue to build, taste will continue to play a role. And we as human beings decide what taste is. It's no good. It doesn't matter whether the AI decides what it likes. We're not selling to the AI, right? We're selling to human beings. So I think, and I'm sure people can make an argument that AI will still somehow play a role in taste-making, and I could see how that might happen, particularly in advertising and communication. But I honestly believe that we appreciate how much taste plays a role on what things are successful in the world, and that therefore human beings will play a creative role in order to determine what those tastes might be.
Yeah, it's so cool. I think we have one more, which is great, but that is so true. Taste is going to be so important, and AI just doesn't have it. That is, yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Or at least its taste is rather boring.
Hey again, Tim. Rafiq Ahmed, Dupala Ventures. Thank you for the great talk. Just a personal question. I know you've worked on thousands and thousands of products and services. What's the one that has moved you the most, and why?
I don't know that I can even answer that question. There is no.
You got to pick one.
Well, okay. So my standard answer for 20 years was the thing that's moved me the most, the design project that has moved me the most in my career is the design of IDEO. Because
it's got to be a thing.
Well, it is a thing. An organization is a thing. And trying to both inherit something that had already started and then design its path forward to be as much of a kind of creative powerhouse as it could be was a remarkably satisfying thing to do. So I know that I knew that wasn't going to satisfy you as an answer. I don't know what if there's a single thing that I've worked on, or even that IDEO's worked on, that I would say is the one that's moved me most, because there's so many things across so many different aspects of of our lives and across society. I mean, you know, I'm incredibly proud of some of the things that we've done in healthcare. But like, you know, one that was at a moment in my career where I sort of felt like, oh, I really get now why this is important was, you know, when we got to work on the first ever portable defibrillator and define how the user experience was going to work for that thing. And, you know, those things have gone on to save a lot of lives, right? And to be able to be at the moment of the beginning of a new kind of a new category, I guess, of product that actually, you know, demonstrably saves people's lives. I mean, that one was pretty meaningful. But there've been so many. I mean, it's the joy of being a designer. The joy of being an entrepreneur is you have an idea and you shepherd that idea all the way to the impact it has in the world. My joy has been to work on lots and lots of the beginnings of things. Can't claim to have shepherded them all the way because, you know, my role and IDEO's role is not to. We could take things quite a long way, but we don't take it all the way. We don't take responsibility for it out in the market in the way that an entrepreneur would. So they're different roles, but I think they're equally satisfying. Yeah, I feel an incredible privilege in being able to have a career where I've gotten to touch so many wonderful people who and so many fascinating problems, and where there's been some chance to do what Herbert Simon talked about, which is take an existing situation and turn it into a better one.
Wow. Well, with that, Tim, thank you so much. Yeah. So inspirational. Yeah. Thank you.